There are moments in life when the line between acting and reality disappears, when a performance is no longer just words on a page, but something that reaches beyond the script and touches the soul. On the set of The Chosen, during an ordinary day of filming, something happened that no one could have expected. Cameras were rolling, lights were in place, but what unfolded was not staged. It was real, raw, and so powerful that even Jonathan, the actor playing Jesus, could not hold back his tears. What the crew witnessed that day has since been described as nothing short of a miracle. The Chosen is not just another television series. It is a project that carries the weight of countless hearts and expectations, because it tells the story of Jesus in a way that feels real and human. Each scene is carefully built with reverence, every moment designed to honor the life of Christ. For the actors, this responsibility is not light. They know that people around the world are watching, hoping to see something that strengthens their faith, something that feels true. Jonathan, who plays Jesus, carries perhaps the greatest burden of all. He is not simply stepping into a role. He is standing in the sandals of one of the most loved figures in human history. Every movement of his hand, every glance, every word he speaks on screen has to feel authentic, because audiences are not just looking for good acting. They are searching for meaning, for comfort, for hope. For Jonathan, this means long hours of preparation, reading scripture, reflecting in prayer, and trying to understand not just the words of Jesus, but the heart behind them. The atmosphere on set is often intense. Crews work under hot lights, scenes require multiple takes, and everyone feels the pressure of perfection. Yet, there is also something different here, something that sets The Chosen apart from other shows. Many of the people working behind the camera are believers themselves, and they approach their craft as more than just a job. They treat it as a mission. The energy is thick with purpose, as if the very air carries the weight of the story being told. It was in this environment, one filled with both tension and reverence, that the unexpected moment occurred. As cameras prepared to capture another scene, Jonathan felt a shift within him. He had played many roles before in his career, but this was different. He could not simply rely on technique or skill. Something deeper was stirring, something he could not explain. He had to surrender himself not just as an actor, but as a person open to an experience far greater than himself. The crew did not know what was about to happen. To them, it was just another day on set. Lines rehearsed, lights adjusted, angles prepared. But in the quiet, as Jonathan stepped into character, a miracle was about to break through the ordinary rhythm of filming. Jonathan had always known that playing Jesus would never be like any other role. It was not simply a chance to perform, it was a calling that demanded everything he had inside of him. From the moment he stepped onto the set, he felt the weight of it pressing against his chest. Each word he spoke on camera had to carry more than accuracy. It had to carry truth. He could not treat it as a script to be recited, because for so many who would watch, these words were sacred. They were prayers, they were memories, they were the foundation of their faith. When Jonathan walked into the filming location that day, the air itself felt heavy. The crew was quiet, more focused than usual, as if they too sensed that this scene was not like the others. The set was simple, nothing extraordinary on the surface, yet somehow the space felt charged. Jonathan paced silently before the cameras began rolling. His lips moved in whispers, prayers only he could hear. His eyes were closed, his breathing uneven. He was not warming up his voice. He was steadying his soul. For days he had struggled with this particular passage. He had read it again and again, trying to find the balance between portraying Jesus as fully divine and yet deeply human. How could one man capture both in a single breath? He carried the responsibility like a weight across his shoulders, and it left him restless at night. He did not want to fail the story, the audience, or the faith of millions who would see the scene. The director gave the signal. Silence wrapped itself around the set. The camera lens focused, the clapperboard snapped shut, and Jonathan stepped forward into his mark. His heartbeat thundered in his chest, but he could not let it show. He lifted his eyes, prepared to speak the line he had rehearsed countless times. Yet as the words formed on his tongue, something unexpected broke through. It was as if the world around him slowed. The light seemed softer, the silence deeper, the air thicker. He felt something press against him. Not in weight, but in presence. He was no longer acting, he was no longer pretending. He was standing there as himself, but also as someone far greater. The words that came were not spoken with performance, they flowed from a place beyond his own ability. And then it happened. A tear slipped from his eye before he even realized it. His voice shook, his body trembled. This was not in the script. This was not planned. Jonathan was overwhelmed not by nerves or exhaustion, but by something holy. In that moment, he was not delivering a line. He was living it. The crew froze. No one dared move. The cameras kept rolling, but behind them the team felt chills run down their arms. They had seen actors cry before, but this was different. This was not a man forcing emotion. It was a man undone by it. The script said nothing about tears. There were no stage directions asking for a trembling voice or shaking hands. Yet Jonathan could not control what was happening inside him. He opened his mouth to speak, and the line that should have been delivered with calm certainty broke apart in his throat. His voice cracked, heavy with something deeper than rehearsed sorrow. He pressed his hand against his chest, as if to steady the storm inside, but the storm had already broken free. The cameras kept rolling, the crew kept silent, but everyone felt it at once. The atmosphere in the room changed. It was no longer just a set, no longer lights and props arranged to resemble an ancient world. Something invisible filled the air, something that did not belong to film production. It was as though the weight of history, the weight of heaven itself, had settled into that space. Jonathan's face glistened with tears. He tried to continue, tried to cling to professionalism, but the words spilled out between sobs. His shoulders shook, his knees nearly gave way, yet he did not stop. He pressed on, each word cutting through the silence like a prayer rising from a heart undone. The more he spoke, the less it sounded like acting. It was as if Jonathan had stepped aside, and something greater was speaking through him. The crew stood frozen, their bodies tense, their eyes locked on him. They were seasoned professionals, used to emotional performances, yet this was different. The makeup artist dropped her brush. A sound technician wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve. The director, who had always been quick to cut and reset when a scene strayed from the script, sat speechless, unable to break the moment. He whispered under his breath, but no command left his lips. One by one, the crew began to feel it. Not just emotion, but presence. A quiet, unexplainable presence that made the hair on their arms stand on end. Goosebumps rose, not from the cold but from awe. Even those who did not claim faith found themselves struggling to explain the sensation. It was more than empathy for an actor. It was as if the room itself had shifted into another space, as if the sacred had entered their midst. Jonathan finally fell silent, unable to speak another word. He dropped his head, his chest heaving, his tears refusing to stop. The cameras lingered on him, capturing every detail, but the crew was no longer thinking of footage. They were holding their breath, afraid to move, afraid to break what had fallen upon them. No one clapped, no one called cut. They simply stood there, caught between earth and heaven, unsure if what they had witnessed was a performance or something divine. For those present, it was not just a scene in a television show. It was a moment that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. When Jonathan's final word faded, the set did not return to normal. The usual rhythm of filming, the director's voice, the shuffle of crew members, the adjusting of equipment, never came. Instead, there was silence, a deep, weighted silence that seemed to stretch far longer than it should have. The cameras were still running, but no one dared speak. It was as if the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for something unseen to pass through. The first sound was not from the director or the crew. It was Jonathan himself standing still, his face streaked with tears. His body trembled, his chest rose and fell like a man who had run a great distance. Yet all he had done was stand and speak. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, but the tears came again. He looked down, unable to meet anyone's gaze, as if even he could not understand what had just happened. The director finally exhaled, the sound breaking the tension, but he did not call cut. He whispered instead, almost to himself, "Keep rolling." It was the only instruction he could find. Normally, he would have reset the scene, adjusted, asked for another take. But not this time. No one wanted to disturb what had happened. It felt fragile, like glass that might shatter if touched. Around the room, the crew shifted uneasily, each one wrestling with what they had just experienced. A lighting technician lowered his head, his lips moving in silent prayer. A camera operator blinked rapidly, fighting back tears, his professional detachment cracked wide open. Even those who did not share Jonathan's faith felt the gravity of it. Something had passed through the room that went beyond explanation. Jonathan lifted his head at last. His eyes were red, his expression raw, yet there was a strange calm on his face. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. He tried again, then shook his head. All he could do was place his hand over his heart and bow slightly toward the crew, as if apologizing, as if thanking them, as if both. For long moments, no one knew what to do. Was this acting? Was this something spiritual? Could both be true at once? The line between performance and reality had blurred so completely that the question itself no longer mattered. What they had witnessed felt alive. Finally, one of the crew whispered, barely loud enough for anyone to hear, "This is more than a show." The words spread like a ripple, unspoken but understood. It was not a line, not a slogan, but a truth that had revealed itself in front of their eyes. In that silence, many felt something stir in their own hearts. Some described it later as a presence. Others called it energy. A few, their voices trembling, called it God. But in that moment, no label was needed. What they felt was real, undeniable, and unforgettable. The silence eventually broke, but not in the way anyone expected. There was no sudden applause, no casual chatter, no return to routine. Instead, the first voices that rose were trembling, uncertain, as if speaking too loudly might disturb whatever had just taken place. A member of the sound crew whispered to another, "I felt that in my bones." The other only nodded, too moved to reply. The director stood frozen, his eyes fixed on Jonathan as though he were afraid that even blinking might cause the moment to dissolve. He had seen hundreds of performances in his career, but nothing like this. Later, he would admit that for the first time in his life, he forgot he was directing. He forgot about cameras, lighting, and schedules. He forgot everything but the overwhelming sense that he was witnessing something sacred. Jonathan finally spoke, his voice low and uneven. "I don't know what just happened," he said. The words hung in the air, heavy and unpolished. He wasn't trying to explain or defend himself. He was confessing. His hands shook as he rubbed at his face, his body still trembling with aftershocks of emotion. He looked at the crew, searching for understanding, but instead found only wide eyes staring back. One of the makeup artists, usually chatty and quick with a joke, pressed a hand over her mouth. She whispered one word that seemed to ripple through the air: miracle. The word was not shouted, not declared, just breathed out like a secret she couldn't keep inside. And though she barely said it above a whisper, others felt it. Heads turned, eyes welled, hearts pounded. It was the only word that fit, even if no one fully understood what it meant. The camera operator, still behind the lens, lowered his head. He had filmed countless takes before, but this time he could not separate himself from the subject. His hands shook as he tried to steady the equipment, but he didn't stop rolling. Later he would tell someone, "I didn't want to miss it." Not the footage, but the feeling. The director finally spoke, his voice softer than it had ever been on set. "We keep it, every frame." He didn't just mean they would use the take in the final cut. He meant something deeper. He meant that this moment had to be preserved, not for editing, not for storytelling, but because it was alive. And so the words spread, from whisper to murmur, from murmur to quiet agreement. Miracle. Some nodded. Some closed their eyes. Some wiped tears without shame. Each person carried a slightly different meaning in their hearts, but all agreed that something had happened that could not be explained by skill, chance, or preparation. Jonathan sat down at last, his body weak but his spirit strangely light. He buried his face in his hands, overcome not by embarrassment, but by awe. He had not planned it, had not forced it, had not even wanted it. Yet it had come uninvited and undeniable. And around him, a crew of professionals who had come to work that day left feeling as if they had been part of something far greater than their craft. When the set finally eased back into motion, the atmosphere was not the same as before. People walked softer, spoke gentler, as if they were in a place that deserved reverence. The cameras were powered down, the lights adjusted, but the sense of awe lingered in the air like the echo of a hymn that refuses to fade. Jonathan sat apart for a while, his costume still draped over him, his eyes red and swollen. He wasn't embarrassed by the tears, but he was unsettled by them. He had acted for years, had trained his voice, his face, his body to respond on command. He knew how to summon emotion, how to deliver it convincingly. But this was not that. He whispered to himself again and again, "That wasn't me." He wasn't saying it as an excuse. He was saying it as a truth. A fellow cast member sat beside him, hesitant but moved. They didn't ask if he was okay. Instead, they said softly, "You weren't alone in that moment." Jonathan lifted his eyes, surprised by the words. The cast member continued, "We all felt it. It wasn't just yours. It was for us too." Jonathan nodded slowly, his throat tight, unable to respond. He had no explanation, no polished reflection. He only knew that when he stepped into the role that day, something far beyond acting had stepped into him. It wasn't about performance, it was about surrender. Meanwhile, the crew gathered in small clusters, their conversations hushed but intense. Some spoke of goosebumps, others of tears they couldn't hold back. A few admitted they had felt as though time itself had stopped. Words like sacred, holy, and miracle slipped into their voices without hesitation, even from those who rarely used them. For the director, the weight of the moment stayed heavy on his shoulders. He replayed it in his mind, frame by frame, not as a filmmaker but as a witness. He confessed later that he didn't want to cut the scene, didn't want to trim or polish it. He wanted it left raw because raw was the truth. Jonathan finally stood, wiping his face, his voice still unsteady. "I don't know why it happened," he said softly, "but I know it wasn't mine." He wasn't trying to be poetic. He was simply confessing what his heart knew. The cast and crew looked at him differently after that, not as an actor playing a role but as a vessel for something greater. Some even struggled to meet his eyes, not out of discomfort but out of reverence, as if they had glimpsed something through him they could not put into words. For Jonathan, the experience became less about the weight of responsibility and more about the gift of surrender. He realized he didn't need to carry the burden alone. The story wasn't his to control. It was his to embody, to give himself to, and to let whatever power wished to move through him take its place. And so the set of The Chosen was never quite the same after that day. What had started as just another shoot became a reminder to everyone present. Sometimes the most powerful moments are not created, they are given. Long after the cameras stopped rolling, the memory of that day refused to fade. For the crew, it was spoken about in quiet conversations during breaks, retold in whispers that carried both wonder and disbelief. For the cast, it became a marker in their journey, a moment when acting no longer felt like acting at all. And for Jonathan, it became something far deeper, a reminder that some roles are not performed, they are lived. He would later admit that he still could not explain it. He had gone into the scene with the same focus and discipline he always carried. But what emerged was beyond his strength, beyond his craft. He said he felt as though he had stepped aside, and something else had stepped in. A force that was not forced, a presence that was not rehearsed. Tears had flowed, not from technique, but from truth. Those who had been there struggled to describe it to others. Words felt too small, too thin. Some called it energy, others called it presence, but most agreed it was something sacred. The word miracle continued to surface, not as a slogan or exaggeration, but as the most honest attempt to describe what could not be captured by reason alone. The footage remained. The cameras had recorded every detail, every tear, every tremor in Jonathan's voice. Yet even those who watched the playback later said it was not the same. The recording showed the image, but it could not capture the atmosphere, the weight, the presence that had filled the room. That belonged only to those who were there. As the project moved forward, the team carried that day with them like a hidden treasure. It shaped the way they worked, the way they approached each scene. It reminded them that this series was not just about creating entertainment, but about touching souls. That it was not just about telling a story, but about opening a door to something larger than themselves. And so the question lingers: was it simply an actor breaking under the pressure of a heavy role?